Hello. So, I've finished EDGEDANCER, and I have a couple of things I want to talk about here before I move on to reading Oathbringer. Um, I want to talk a bit more about Lift. I want to talk about Nail as a character. Nail or Nalan or Nin or however you want to call him. And I want to talk about Arklow, because Arklow is a lot. I'll leave Arklow for the end. Um, I'm going to start with Lift. So, putting aside my musings from the previous video about how other interpretations of Lift might make her an even more interesting character, um, the character we have here is already extremely interesting. We're getting some fascinating insights into her psychology. This is a very uniquely written child character. Child characters tend to be very hit or miss in fiction. It is very difficult for a lot of authors to strike the right balance when writing a child character, to not make them sort of cartoonishly caricature children, but also to not make them sound too much like they're just adults. And I think Sanderson strikes the right balance here. Lift has every bit as much emotional and mental and internal complexity as any adult character Sanderson has written. Excuse me, my air conditioner is making too much noise. Um, she has every bit as much complexity as any adult character that Sanderson has written, but she is also childish in I think a very realistic way. She has this way of um, sort of explaining the world to herself to make it conform with what she wants it to be, which I think is very characteristic of children. Um, and I think one of my favorite elements of Lift that is shown throughout EDGEDANCER here is the fact that she will often make extremely intelligent and incisive commentary on something, but she will do it in a way that sounds juvenile and stupid to other people. She will uh, say things that make it sound like she is being silly, but she's actually being quite profound. And usually this is about food. Like the things she says are usually about eating and food because of her personality, and that's her main interest. Um, but for example, in the first part of EDGEDANCER, I don't think I talked about this in the previous video. In the first part, she talks about how she had to leave Azimir because she was afraid that the Azish viziers were going to eat her. Uh, and Wingdle obviously dismisses this as absurd. But then, as she keeps talking, it becomes clear she doesn't mean literally eat her. She's talking as though she means literally eat her, but what she means is a metaphorical kind of eating. She means that who she is as a person, her uniqueness, her identity, is going to be metaphorically consumed by the court of Azimir and replaced with a version of Lift that they want her to be. She fears being devoured by expectations and responsibilities. Um, and because of who she is as a person, she expresses this as, "Oh, they were gonna eat me." But like what she actually means is a very complex and deep thought. Um, Likewise, here in the second part, when she is writing to Gox through the span read, or well, when she's having other people write for her, um, she, in a very critical moment when Gox is worried about the future of Azir as the storm comes, Lift just starts talking about pancakes, and Gox is like, or rather not Gox, but the woman writing um, with the span read, I believe, says something along the lines of, "This seems like a very frivolous thing to talk about right now. We have more important concerns." And then Lift says, "No, you don't. How you're going to feed your people is an extremely important concern. I'm talking about food because that's what you should be talking about more than anything else right now. But again, she expresses this by simply talking about how delicious the pancakes are in Tashik. So this whenever moments like this come up, and they come up a fair amount of times here, I'm always impressed. Another example is actually um, something that I didn't realize myself, but that Brandon himself mentions in the postscript to EDGEDANCER, which is that back in Words of Radiance, during Lift's singular chapter, Lift says that she's been 10 for 3 years. And at the time, that seems like a joke about how she doesn't want to grow up or whatever, or she's making a joke about her age or something. But in reality, she really thinks that. She is convinced that she has been 10 for 3 years because she believes that she has stopped aging. She's apparently wrong, but she believes that she would have gotten her wish from the Night Watcher. Apparently, she hasn't, but at the time she thought she did. By the way, I'm curious to see where that goes. I'm curious to see. I'm guessing that what happens, because this is always what happens with the wishes, magical wishes in stories. I'm guessing what happens is that the Night Watcher did grant her wish, but not in the way that Lift expected, because she didn't phrase it the right way or something. Anyway, by the end of this story, Lift has had a ton of character development, so I can see why this story is basically considered required reading, even though it's like a side novella. So she's had a ton of character development. She's sworn her second oath. She's learned to summon a shard blade. And she has accepted a level of responsibility. She's going back to Azamir at the end of this, I think, to kind of start her own chapter of the Knights Radiant, if I'm understanding her motives here correctly, which is going to be fascinating if she does that. Like, it's going to be really interesting if she finds a bunch of Radiants in Azir and, like, throughout the Aziri Empire. And then by the time she makes contact with Dalinar's group, she's already got like her own posse. That's gonna be. I really hope that happens because that would be really interesting to see. Um, I'm just imagining. I'm imagining Dalinar and Lift like vying for command of the Knights Radiant. Like this experienced general who rules one of the most powerful nations in the world, and then this fucking 12-year-old. That would be incredible. I'm not sure it's going to happen. It's just I'm just theorizing about it. She's also got a much nicer relationship with Windle by the end of this story. She's no longer calling him a Voidbringer. Uh, Overall, I'm just kind of surprised that this was relegated to a novella and wasn't part of one of the proper Stormlight books. I guess it just wouldn't fit in terms of the timeline, because you'd need to have a bunch of chapters essentially all set before the start of Oathbringer. I'm guessing this all happens. I'm guessing Oathbringer happens after this. Um, and the other reason I feel like this novella maybe shouldn't have been a novella and should have just been part of one of the books proper is Nail or Nalan. So the fact that Nalan, one of the heralds, has had a massive change in his character motivations as of the end of this story feels like it's going to be immensely relevant to the main plot of future books, and it seems weird that it happens in this like side novella. So Nalan has essentially had a mirror of Seth's development last book. So both Nalan and Seth, which is interesting because they're working together now, but both Nalan and Seth have now had a moment where they've realized that their assumptions have been wrong, and that because of their mistaken assumptions, they have committed unspeakable atrocities. We still don't know how Nalan feels about that. We don't necessarily have any indication that Nalan feels a ton of guilt for all the Surge Binders he's killed. I'm hoping he does. I'm hoping he's capable of that. I'm hoping he's human enough for that, but I don't know. Um, but I do think that this might be something that he and Seth can potentially bond over in the future. I also like that Lift was clever enough to do this, and I like the twist, because like the oath she swears at the end of this is, "I will listen to those who are ignored," and you would assume that what that means is she will listen to the downtrodden in society, the lowly, the forgotten, etc. And of course it does mean that. But it also means listening to people like Nalan. Like the fact that she figured out Nalan's motives because she listened to him, and he, in her mind, is someone who has been ignored. He's been ignored by the other heralds, by other radiants, etc., etc. And so, yeah, she's right. Like, listening to him, even though he's a powerful, evil man in a position of power, is part of that oath. And it's worked out for her here. She protected the downtrodden by listening to someone who is not downtrodden, but who is ignored. So she listened to him, and she actually resolved his internal conflict in a way that was meaningful to who he is and what his motives are. So Lift has a ton of potential to be one of the most empathetic characters in Stormlight going forward, which I'm really interested in, because she's not like, she's rude and abrasive and brash, but if you combine that with her also being extremely empathetic, that could be really interesting, like a really interesting tension. A tension that is also demonstrated, by the way, by the character of the Stump in this story. Like, the Stump is also a rude, abrasive, seemingly harsh and cruel person who has also dedicated her entire life to helping disabled children. So like, it's this contrast, I guess, between extreme empathy and extreme like abrasiveness that is present in both characters in different ways. I do wonder if we'll see the Stump again in the future. I wonder if we'll see more of this character going forward. I do hope we will, because I feel like her actually properly joining the Order of the Knights Radiant would be really interesting. I feel like the Stump, man, I want an interaction between Dalinar and the Stump now. I feel like that would be very, very amusing to watch. The light changed. I'm sorry, I'm now veiled in darkness for some reason. Anyway, the other big thing that happens here is Arklow. So in the middle of all this, all this insane character development for Lift and Nail, and the revelation of the Stump being a Radiant and all that, we have this chapter that's just completely insane. We have this chapter that reveals that there are apparently immortal entities made of bugs on Roshar. Like swarms of bugs that form a single mind. And we also get hints that there are more different kinds of immortals around than just this guy. So he's not a herald, he makes that very clear. He's not a spren. He's his own thing. He's something unique. Well, not unique, but he's like a different kind of a new kind of creature. He refers to the kind of creature that he is as the Sleepless. Like, he tells Lift, "Oh, if you ever meet another of the Sleepless, tell them Arklow sent you." But he also says this. He says, I can pass for human almost as well as a Sia can these days, or Saya. So that's another thing we don't know anything about, but apparently it's a thing, the Sia or Saya. And he also says, when one achieves immortality, one must find purpose beyond the struggle to live, as old Axes always said. So what that's telling me is that Axes the Collector from the first book is actually immortal. That there was some ambiguity there, because like his people are perceived as immortal by some, but there isn't necessarily any explicit confirmation in the text of that chapter in the first book that it's true. Like it wasn't clear whether that was just a stereotype, like a superstition, or a fact. Apparently, it's a fact. So whatever the hell Axes is, I need to reread that chapter. I've kind of forgotten the details a bit. But whatever the hell Axes is, those people are immortal. There's something called the Sia, which may be the same thing or maybe a completely different third thing. And there's the Sleepless. And none of these things have interacted with the main plot of Stormlight at all so far. They're apparently just around. Um, which is pretty interesting, and I'm wondering when and if they're going to sort of burst onto the scene. Um, the other thing I want to talk about with Arklow is this sentence. His Kremlings coursed around him. Several climbed up his face, and his eyes crawled out, new ones replacing them, so that he went from being dark-eyed to light. This is an incredibly unnerving mental image, just horrifically disturbing. And I want to talk about it because I've noticed something with Sanderson, which is that Sanderson has a talent for writing horror, essentially. And he chooses not to. Like, he never writes horror, which I'm happy for because I don't like horror. But I do like the aesthetics of horror. And Sanderson is a master of that. From the Inquisitors in Mistborn to whatever the hell this is, to the very concept of Shardblades and what they do when they kill you and what that looks like, to stuff like what it's like being an Elantrian during the events of Elantris. Like, there are all of these moments of visceral horror in Sanderson's writing that I'm just kind of surprised by whenever they happen, because it's such a different vibe from most of his writing, but it works because he is very good at it, and like, this is a mental image I will remember for a while, like Arklow's eyes turning into bugs and crawling out, and then new ones crawling in. Um, Absolutely incredible moment. Anyway, that's largely it for this part of the story. It's not a very long section, so I don't have as many thoughts as I maybe usually do. But I do have a couple details I want to talk about. In addition to that, first, when asked whether he can take any shape, Windle tells Lift, "I must be metal. There is a connection between our power when condensed and metal." Now, anyone who's read any Mistborn book will immediately have alarm bells going off in their head. That. So, the way investiture works on Roshar is also apparently tied to metal. Not as inherently as it is on Scadrial, but still, there's like a clear connection there. This is one thing that I've noticed as I've gotten further into the Cosmere. I've mentioned this in previous videos, is that there are more and more, not necessarily explicit connections between the magic systems of the different worlds, but more resonances. Like, it's becoming more and more clear that there are certain laws or rules, etc., that are fundamentally shared between the different magic systems. So, for example, you have the way connection works on Scadrial is clearly meant to evoke the way a lot of the magic systems on Cell work, with strong ties to geography. And now we have this. where the way investiture works here has clear connections to the way investiture works on Scadrial. Um, and in the previous book, in Words of Radiance, we had that scene where Shallan uses her powers and breathes out Stormlight in a way that is described eerily similarly to the way breath works on Nulthus. Um, so I'm still not 100. I wasn't 100% sure if these were intentional links until this line about metal. Now I'm almost certain. I feel like bringing up metal and saying that investiture is inherently tied to it is a very purposeful thing for Brendan to do. Like, he cannot possibly have written that without realizing that it's a clear connection to Mistborn. So I'm now fairly confident that all of these connections I've been drawing have not been by accident, and that we are meant to be realizing at this point that the different forms of investiture share some of their basic rules between them. Which makes sense, since they all come from the shards, and all the shards come from the same source, Adonalsium, so it makes sense that there would be these connections. The other interesting little detail I want to talk about here is how Azir works. So, I had assumed that the prime Akasix of Azir was only the Emperor of Azir, but apparently that's not true. He's the Emperor of all Makabak, which is, I assume, a wider region of Roshar. So, for example, the country where this story takes place in, whose name I've forgotten now, Tashik, I think, is also, while it is an independent country, it technically recognizes the Empire of Azir. But it doesn't actually recognize it. Like, it's a very symbolic thing. I believe it's mentioned at one point that essentially the Emperor of Azir calls himself an emperor, and everyone in his quote-unquote empire just kind of humors him about it. But in reality, they're all independent nations, and when push comes to shove, the will of those independent nations and their rulers is going to overrule that of the emperor. And that's interesting, because that is actually how a lot of empires worked historically. Like, that is how in many cases the medieval Holy Roman Empire worked. Holy Roman Empire, by which I mean Germany. So not actual Rome. Rome did not work like that. Like, Rome was very much a like empire in fact as well as on paper. But the Holy Roman Empire in many cases was recognized by most other Christian nations, but they weren't actually willing to like be subservient to it. And the same is true of Byzantium in the east. Like, here actually in Serbia, where I am right now, Serbia was technically part of the Byzantine Empire, and there was a lot of ceremonial and sort of, I guess, performative prostration before the emperor in Constantinople during that time. Um, but all of these countries were very much also their own independent nations, and weren't necessarily always willing to go along with what Byzantium wanted. So it's interesting that we're seeing this sort of model of imperialism presented here, because I feel like this is a model of imperialism that is historically very real, but it often gets overlooked in fantasy. In fantasy, there is this assumption that once you officially on paper rule a territory as a monarch, you actually rule it, and that's just not how this worked throughout history. A lot of people were willing to just go along with it and say, yeah, of course we recognize your authority. Of course you're the sovereign here. Sure. And then just go about their own business and ignore the guy. And I'm glad to see that we're having that sort of nuance of historical politics represented here. Um, that's about all I have to say about EDGEDANCER. I really enjoyed it. I'm very glad I read it. Um, it, it felt meaningful and necessary to read. In order to fully understand the story going forward. I liked seeing firsthand the impact of the Everstorm in a different place. I liked the world building of Tashik as a different nation. Um, I just liked everything that was here. Really, I don't think I have a single complaint about this novella. Uh, it didn't obviously blow me away the way Words of Radiance did, but I don't think it was meant to. Words of Radiance was like this big epic explosion of plot and characters, whereas this is a very focused and personal story of growth for Lift. And in a way, that makes it just as good, if not more compelling for me, because I'm a very character-driven reader. I like character development, and there's a lot of it here for one of my favorite characters. Brandon actually says in the postscript that Lift is one of his favorite characters, despite not having a lot of scenes so far. And I feel the same way. You can tell that she's one of his favorite characters because he writes her with such incredible skill. Um, I know that there's a lot of people who don't like Lift, apparently, or at least don't like her as much, and kind of were bored by her chapter in Words of Radiance. But I'm going on the record once again, even though I've said it before, that I am very much not one of those people. I want more of Lift, always, forever. Anyway, I'm gonna go read Oathbringer now. That'll take a while. It's a big book. Um, bye.